to day 3 of the virtual tour with Rob Lyman, the Burma Campaign. We're going to be going into the Arakan 3 times in the next hour, I believe. The last 2 days, we've been pushed for time and haven't had a lot of time for questions. So I'm going to keep my spiel very short today, just to say, as with yesterday, in your handout section, you will see 5 maps, all of which will be used in Rob's presentation today, so you can use them. And again, if you're watching the recording, they'll be sent as an attachment in the email in the morning. And as always, do use the question tab for questions. And if you want to put a question directly to Rob and unmute yourself, then hopefully there'll be time for that at the end of the session. Rob, we have a few questions from yesterday which we didn't get round to, which because they refer slightly more to session 2 than session 3, I thought I might put them quickly to you before you start, if I may.
Yeah.
One is from Mark Watson. He was just asking about the British civilians in Burma at the time of the Japanese invasion, and how many of those would have ended up being recruited for the Burma Rifles.
Well, the Burma, many British civilians or expatriates in Burma joined the Burma Rifles. They tended to join before the outset of the Japanese invasion. So these would have been people who were recruited in 1940 and 41. Yes, so quite a significant number of expatriates joined then. They knew the country, they were employed by firms who worked in the country, and their knowledge of the country was, and of the people, was far greater than that of officers who came in, either regular officers serving the British or Indian armies, or of emergency commission officers who were commissioned during the war. So yes, quite significant numbers.
Okay, and on a similar point, we've got a question from Oliver Backhouse, who quite a specific comment. I think his ancestors were in Burma at the time, and he's saying that they had attempted to evacuate the country by going by boat up the Chind Win, but their boat got turned back, and then the end had to get air evacuated out from Shui, as a Shuibu or Shuigu, one of those Kachin towns. And he was asking, why would it have been that ship of civilians would have been turned away or turned back on the Chindwin, if you know?
Well, it's hard to know now, but actually, if you know the Chindwin, you know that in the summer it can get very, very shallow, and I mean, even in the summer, it's very hard to get up to Kaliwa, because although the Chindwin and the Irrawaddy is very wide. I mean, I've been on the Irrawaddy a couple of times. I've been stuck there for days because the river is low. Of course, it's very different when the rains come. So it may well have been that, but actually the probable reason is that European evacuation plans had begun in December 1941, and they were accelerated in January and February. I mentioned this yesterday. There was a deeply unsatisfactory racist tinge to this, and that white Europeans were given priority to evacuate. And the flights left from Mingalodon in Rangoon, Magway, which is where an RAF squadron was based, Mandalay, Shuibo, Myitkyina. And of course, the last site of the evacuation by aircraft from Burma using C-47 Skytrain, so the Douglas Dakota that we all call them in the UK, were from Myitkyina. And the stories associated with that is quite terrible. So Oliver, if I'm sort of adding everything up, I would say the boat was turned back in order to get your family up to Shuibo or Myitkyina to fly out.
Lovely. And just finally, from David Jervis, he regarding your talk yesterday, he says you referred to the Allied forces' first significant success during the retreat of 11 to 14 April 1942 at a place where he could not quite catch the name. Something like
It's Kakogwa.
Now, how would you spell it?
Okay.
He couldn't find it on a map.
It's K-O-K-K, so K-O-K-K-O Ogwa, O-G-W-A. Yes, let me just write that down because I've been there. Ogwa, yeah, K-O-K-K-O-G-W-A. And it's
okay, it's quite close. Perfect.
You'll be able to find it. Kakogwa. I've got some photographs. I was there in March and took some photographs of the place.
Brilliant. Well, that's it for now. We've got some more questions which I'll put to you at the end, and as always, those of you listening, please do send your questions in during the talk, and I'll leave it to you now, Rob, to take us into day 3.
Okay, that's brilliant. Well, good evening, everyone, and very nice to see you all. I hope you've been taking your MEPA cream if you've been given that by your doctor, and slapping on that sun cream because it is hot out there. We're going to do a bit of a shift in geography now. Remember, yesterday we were focused, and the day before we were focused on Tenasserim, central Burma. We're now going to go to the Burmese coast, known then as Arakan, which runs down on the Bay of Bengal from India into Burma. And we've got a couple of maps that will cover that later. And we're going to try and cover the 3 campaigns in Arakan: 1942, 3, 1943, 4, 1945. I'm going to concentrate on the first 2 campaigns because they illuminate some of the problems that were associated with fighting in Burma, certainly from the Allied perspective. And the 1945 campaign went so spectacularly well because the 14th Army, 15 Corps and the 14th Army had learned the lessons of the previous 2 years. But I've got my little, I think I've got my little red dot. So when I come to a map, I'll use that to help. So these 3 campaigns, the first campaign in 1942 began really almost as soon, the conversation around going back into Burma, Arakan clearly is part of Burma, began as soon as the retreat had been completed in May 1940. Wavell started talking about constructing plans that would send troops back into Burma. Wavell, as you will know by now, had a overestimated or underestimated rather the power of the Japanese, and couldn't believe the Japanese were as good as everyone made out, and believed really from the outset that if only the British could go back in force and launch a conventional campaign, they would beat the Japanese soundly. The Japanese no longer had the benefit of surprise, and he was confident that in a man-for-man match, the Japanese would be soundly defeated. Now, Churchill agreed. Churchill wanted an offensive to be launched as soon as possible. You will recognize, of course, because I mentioned a few times now, between sort of May and October, we're in the monsoon, and in Arakan, we're talking about lots and lots of water. We're talking about between 300 and 500 inches a year, which is 10 times what we get in the UK. It's absolutely astonishing. I was caught in a rainstorm today, and my first thought was, well, this is a little bit like the monsoon. My rainstorm here lasted about 5 minutes. The rainstorms in Burma can last a very, very long time indeed. Anyway, to cut a long story short, an offensive was authorized when the monsoon finished. So we're looking at the end of September and early October. And I'm going to go to the next slide to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So this is this map is the coast of Arakan, and on the Indian side we've got Chittagong up the top, now part of Bangladesh, and then we've got Cox's Bazar here on the coast. We then come down to a place called Foul Point, which is down here. And Foul Point is at the end of a very long peninsula, along which there are a number of fishing villages. One is an insignificant little fishing village called Don Bike. We'll talk about that there a little bit later on. There's Don Bike there. And then we go down to the island of Akyab. And this river that comes out here is the Kaladin River that comes out of the Kaladin Valley, which follows this route down here. So in terms of the geography, it's worth just understanding this very briefly. A number of main points of interest. The first is this little port of Mongdor at the entrance to the Naf estuary. This is the Naf estuary here and the Naf River. And then right along down the middle of the Arakan coastline is the Arakan Range, or often known as the Mayu Range, sorry, M-A-Y-U. And then on the other side, so the eastern side of the Mayu Range, is the Kalapandan River. And the Kalapandan River drops from up here where I am here through Tong Bazaar. Tong Bazaar, significant village, down to Butidang, another significant town on the Kalapanzan River, and that drops down into the Mayu River, leading out to the sea. And the plan that was originally pulled together by Slim. Now, Slim had come back, he had commanded the Burma Corps. Well, when he got back to India, he was confronted by Noel Irwin, who is the commander of 4th Corps. And at the time in Eastern Army, the Eastern Army was the army in India responsible for the defense of the eastern part of the country. And it had 2 corps. It had 4 corps based at Imphal, and it had 15 corps based back in Calcutta. They were both very weak, didn't have a huge number of resources attached to them. But Slim was given command of 15 corps, and Noel Irwin had 4 corps. And in the process of 1942, Irwin was promoted after General Charles Broad was retired. He was promoted to command the Eastern Army. So we've got a sense of how big the defences are, the Indian Army defences are in the east of India. Effectively, we've got 2 corps, we've got about 4 divisions. We're not talking about a huge number of men, maybe 35, 40,000 men. And one of the real problems that we have in this part of India is the very long lines of communication running back into India. From Calcutta into Imphal, we're talking about 750 miles. From Calcutta down to Chittagong, about 400. So anything that happens on the front line, and in this case here in Arakan, it only happens at the end of a very long line of communication. So we're going to need shipping going into Cox's Bazar and shipping down into Mongdor as well. We're also going to need roads. Remember, I mentioned in the last couple of days this fact that the British and Indian divisions were mechanized, and they were philosophically and doctrinally locked to the road. They needed roads to service the forward fighting formations. And so one of the problems that the planners faced when they were looking at Arakan was to work out how the troops were going to be supplied, because there was no all-weather road in Arakan at all. All the roads were fair weather, i.e. they could only be used in the dry period between October and April. But I've put that up there on the slide, little hint, Slim's 3-phase hop, skip and jump plan for Operation Cannibal. Operation Cannibal was the name of the offensive in Arakan in 1942. The planners in India Command were working out what the best plan they thought for the operation, and Slim at the same time in 15 Corps rather was doing the same. And this is essentially the plan that Slim came up with, and actually it was a plan that received widespread acceptance in India Command as well. And it entailed the advance of a division, a 14th Division under a chap called General Wilfred Lloyd, moving from Cox's Bazar all the way down here to Bawli Bazar, through Goat Bazar, Bawli Bazar, to build up a position between Mongdor and Butidang. Now, just whilst we're here, crossing the Mayu range between Mongdor and Butidang are a set of tunnels. Very, very famous. The Battle of the Tunnels in 43, 44 is where my red dot is pointing at the moment. And the idea was that 14 Division would advance down the Mayu range, and that it would build a road behind it. Clearly it needed a road to be able to provide its sustenance. But at the same time, a long-range penetration operation would be conducted by a brigade, say 3,000 or so men, under a chap called Ord Wingate, Brigadier Ord Wingate, who was an old friend of Wavell's from his days in Eritrea. Wingate had been in Burma briefly. At the end of the campaign, had gone to Wavell and said, look, we can beat the Japanese by using long-range penetration operations behind their lines to destabilize them. So the idea that Slim came up with was, well, why don't we push a long-range penetration operation on mules and Shank's pony down the Culloden Valley, no roads, by the way, in order to maintain pressure on the Japanese flank. If the Japanese operating in Arakan were aware or were worried about their right flank, they would have reason to be by virtue of this brigade operating down here. But the strategic objective, perhaps in a lesson that had been learned in the early part of 1942, the whole purpose of going into Arakan was the airfields on Akyab. The airfield on Akyab, there was one airfield on this island here, it was only 330 miles from Rangoon. The economic flying distance for aircraft was about 250 miles, C-47 aircraft. So there is no way that an offensive could be launched against Rangoon from India without a stepping stone. And Akyab and Arakan were regarded as the stepping stone for the conduct of operations against Rangoon. They were later to be called Operation Dracula, an amphibious operation against Rangoon. And also, by the way, operations in central Burma, because if we were to step back at the map and then cross from about where my pointer is here, and we went eastwards, we would go over the An Pass through Tongup into the Irrawaddy Delta. The Irrawaddy Delta is sort of running up along here where my pointer is on the screen. So it gives access to Rangoon. It also gives access to central Burma. If we didn't attack Arakan or advance into Arakan, it would make life difficult if we were focusing on invading Upper Burma from, say, Imphal and Manipur. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And the reality is, as Allied planners, we couldn't do one without the other. If we were to invade central Burma without capturing Arakan, the Japanese would simply use out the left flank to destabilize us. And that was part of the Japanese plan, which I'll mention in a moment, Operation Hargo. So that was the plan. We would have a conventional advance from Cox's Bazar down the coast by 14th Indian Division, moving at the pace of the road that was being built behind them. We'd have a long-range penetration brigade operating in the Kaladan Valley, and we'd have an amphibious assault against Akyab by two brigades, an Indian brigade, the 29th Indian Brigade, and the 6th British Brigade. 6th British Brigade, part of the famous 2nd British Division based at the time in Pune. So that's the general plan for operations in September and October 1943. What actually happened? Well, quite a number of things happened. The first thing that happened was this chap, this gentleman on the screen, whose name was General Noel Irwin. And if you've read my books, you will understand something of the animosity that existed between Slim and Noel Irwin. But he's a very interesting character, actually. He commanded the 6th Brigade in the British Expeditionary Force in Europe. He had been commissioned into the Essex Regiment. He was, by all accounts, a very brave man and a very good soldier with a fine reputation. And in fact, the last days and weeks of the life of the British Expeditionary Force in France, he was in command of the 2nd Division. And he brought the 2nd Division back to Britain in good order, without its heavy weapons, but in good order. And he understood the mechanics of defeat and the emotional impact of defeat as well. But he had arrived in India in early 1942 and been given command of 4 corps in Imphal, and he watched the Burma Corps come marching back from Burma, and he wasn't very pleased at what he saw. And I think in that moment, he dismissed the Indian Army from his mind as being an effective mechanism for warfighting. He also dismissed Slim, and there are a number of possible reasons for that, which we don't have time to go into tonight. But more than that, he was a character who thought perhaps too highly of himself than he ought to have done. I was talking to Bertie before we all started tonight, and I've come to the conclusion that Noel Irwin was one of those men who thought that he had a place in history. He was a man of destiny. He believed he had been briefed. He believed he'd been brought out to India to take charge of a failing army and to reinvigorate it and take it to glory. So what he did now that he'd been promoted to commander of the Eastern Army, so it is 2 Corps, 4 and 15. 15, of course, commanded by Slim. Talking to Wavell, he said, "Okay, Wavell, we want an operation in Arakan. I will command it." So we have a situation where the army commander takes command of 15 Corps. He tells Slim to go back and train the rest of Eastern Army for war, which actually was a very good thing. Slim was taken away from responsibility for fighting or planning and delivering this operation, and Irwin said, "I'll do it myself." At the same time, Wingate's brigade were distracted and taken elsewhere and weren't available for the operation, which was a serious mistake. Irwin could have retained Wingate services if he had fought for him, but I think the reality is Irwin didn't really know much about long-range penetration, didn't understand its potentiality, and in any case was a committed conventionalist. But at the same time, remember we're talking about 1942, the amphibious shipping that was planned for this operation all of a sudden disappeared because of the torch landings in North Africa. So all that Irwin had in September 1942 was the 14th Indian Division, the troops that had been allocated to the amphibious operation. So he decided that he'd carry on anyway. It didn't get off to a very good start, Arakan 1, as we all call it now, and the 14th Indian Division started its march through the Mayo Range and was stopped very quickly by the Japanese, not by Japanese in strength, but by small patrol actions, aggressive Japanese patrols far forward of their positions in the remainder of the Arakan. Now, I just tell you, at this time in Arakan, the Japanese had about just short of 2 battalions of men. So we're not talking about very large numbers. But aggressive fighting soldiers can do an enormous amount of damage to the psychological balance of power in these situations. And this is exactly what happened to the 14th Indian Division. They were given instructions to build a road through the hills, and they were building a road through the hills. And all of a sudden, they encountered these hit-and-run attacks by the Japanese, ambushes, and so on, and really struggled to find a way to counter them. And to an extent, this really stopped operations for a month or a month and a half through end of September, early October, until they were restarted in November. A problem, of course, at this time was the monsoon was still going. The monsoon kept going through to the end of October, and very, very heavy rainfall interrupted operations. But any idea that this would be a fast operation was very clearly realized not to be the case. Irwin got a little bit cross with the 14th Indian Division, but there wasn't really much anyone could do about it. If you were going to advance at the pace of your slowest road digger, then you were stuck to that. In November, when the operation began again, Irwin gave instructions to the 6th Brigade. He brought 6th Brigade up and said, "Okay, I want you to advance as fast as you can and get down to Foul Point, go down all the way down through the peninsula, down to Foul Point here, and capture it for me. And whilst you're doing that, 6th Brigade, the 14th Division will come up here and we'll bifurcate the division and move down from Buthudang towards Rathidang as well." So on both sides of the Mayu River. So instructions were given to achieve that to get to Foul Point by the middle of January. And the story here is it was quite good. The 6th Brigade made very good progress, didn't come across much opposition. 6th Brigade, a very well-trained, experienced, combat experienced British brigade, part of a very well-trained, experienced British division in conventional fighting. But the British battalions made their way down to Dongbike and met at Dongbike the first real opposition to the advance. The Japanese by this stage had realized that what Irwin was trying to do and had flooded reinforcements into Arakan, not a huge number, and another 250 troops, so a third of a battalion, came into Dongbike. Dongbike was a fishing village along the beach. The a number of very, very deep water courses had been created over time from the Mayu Range as the river came out onto the sea. Huge amounts of water, creating very, very deep chongs. And these were proved to be very natural defensive positions for the Japanese. So the Japanese created a very strong defensive position in the chongs in front of Dombaik, just simply by digging into the mangrove swamps, covering the pits and defensive positions they built with wood and digging very deeply as well, so that the defensive positions couldn't be seen. And the Japanese were very, very good builders of defensive positions. So by the time the 6th Brigade arrived and they found themselves being shot at, it took a considerable amount of time for the British to understand where the enemy was. In fact, right until the end of the campaign, the end of February at Dombaik, many of the Japanese positions still had not been identified. And what the 6th Brigade started to do was to launch frontal attacks against these enemy positions, thinking that by weight of infantry attack, supported by artillery, remember they had 25-pounder guns as well, that the Japanese would be overwhelmed. But the Japanese had a very good counter to artillery, and they simply evacuated. As the first sound of the artillery was heard, they would evacuate their forward positions. They would leave one man and a machine gun in the forward deep trenches, covered in logs, and they'd all run back to cover. And then as soon as the artillery lifted, they would run back to the forward positions. The British infantry would then advance over open ground and would be slaughtered. So the story of Dombaik is a really, really tragic story. It's a story of considerable casualties. These are some really evocative paintings by Anthony Gross of the Royal Academy, who was at Dombaik. Many famous British infantry battalions were involved in countless and repeated assaults against the Japanese positions. But at no time was the Japanese position, we're talking about 250 men here, tiny, really, 250 Japanese soldiers. At no time was the Japanese position at Dombaik threatened. Now, there's a really serious series of questions that one needs to ask oneself about Arakan and Dombaik. Why were these repeated frontal assaults launched? Why was no innovation sought? Why was Dombaik so important? Could Dombaik have been bypassed? Could troops have been sent through the Mayu Range? Could patrols have been sent out to try and cut off the enemy lines of communication? Well, none of those were tried. They were all suggestions made, in fact, by Slim, who was invited by Irwin to come and undertake a commission of inquiry in March 1943 to understand why the British weren't making any progress in Arakan. And Slim asked all these very basic questions. And the divisional commander, Lloyd, and Irwin both dismissed Slim's conclusions on the basis that these things had been tried before, and in any case, the terrain was too difficult, and so on. What we have here in 1942 and early 1943 were repeated attempts by British troops and Indian troops to do the same thing again and again and again in the face of overwhelming evidence that those efforts weren't going to be ever crowned with glory. And it's a real tragedy as a historian looking at this again and trying to understand why it was that these mistakes were made repeatedly. And of course, if you fail in battle, your morale isn't going to be sustained for very long, is it? What Irwin did was he reinforced failure by pouring in more fresh brigades. And this is the problem. Irwin was actually the army commander, so he had access to all of the maneuver brigades in his army. And at the time at which Slim was sent in to do his evaluation of the campaign, Irwin had 9 brigades under the command of the 14th Indian Division, when a division of infantry would normally have 3 brigades. So Poor old Wilfred Lloyd, the GOC of 14th Indian Division, had 3 times as many troops under command than was normal, without all the required administrative and tactical support necessary to maintain effectively a core fighting in Arakan. The reality was neither Irwin nor Lloyd had the intellectual or experiential wherewithal to solve the problems posed by Arakan. They weren't imaginative. They couldn't think of anything out of the ordinary. They couldn't do things that were necessary to be able to break the deadlock. And I've been looking at Arakan for many, many years, and only recently have I come to this idea that actually what Irwin wasn't able to do was precisely what the Japanese did. So my challenge to Irwin then would have been to say, well, why didn't you look at what the Japanese did in early 1942, so less than a year before, and try and copy the success of their offensive? How did they manage their offensive into Burma in 1942 in such a spectacular way, and in a way that it gave them success, and in a way that is not something you're managing to achieve? Irwin wasn't the man to be able to think those bright, imaginative, innovative thoughts about using his forces in a different way. So this idea that Irwin had of himself being the new man coming out here to solve all these problems, to face the Japanese and make a name for himself, must have been a little bit like pricking a balloon. And the situation the dire situation was reinforced by a Japanese counteroffensive in March. We don't have a huge amount of time to talk about it, but the map actually says it all. The Japanese had very few troops in Arakan, but they didn't bother trying to counter the British at Dombaik. They simply left the third of a battalion that they had there to continue fighting off the British attacks. Instead, they cut across country to Indin. We can see that here, a little fishing village at Indin. So by cutting across the Mayu range and getting down to Indin, they were able to cut off the troops at Dombaik, which then forced the British to rush up the coast to try to get through Indin without being caught. They started infiltrating through the hills here to Bithidang, and they also started coming in from across the Kaladin Valley to Tung Bazaar, so right behind the British, who were trying to establish a base along the tunnel area between Mungdor and Botidong. The Japanese successfully launched their counterattack and achieved all their objectives within a month. The British were forced back. The very fine commander of 6th Brigade was killed by his own artillery, in fact, at Indin, quite a significant battle at Indin, and all the other troops of the 6th Brigade and the remaining troops of the 14th Division who had been fighting here were pushed back all the way, not just to Mungdor and Botidong, but way beyond that to positions where which were maintained up here, where my arrow is now right at the top of the Naf estuary. So forward troops were in Goat Bazaar, but the British had lost Arakan spectacularly on the basis of a plan that was again underestimated the Japanese, didn't understand how the Japanese fought, didn't have a clear view about its capabilities, and assumed that the old way of doing things in the British and Indian armies would be sufficient to defeat the Japanese in the future. So that was really quite depressing. It's very interesting, actually, that I've got a few quotes for you here from Arakan 1. The command psychiatrist of the of India Command said that the 14th Indian Division is for all practical purposes a psychological casualty. The morale had reached rock bottom, as I suggested earlier. If you're repeatedly failing in battle, it's very hard to persuade the soldiers that you've got the tools to be able to achieve success. They can see for themselves that doing the same thing repeatedly and which receives the same response isn't going to achieve battlefield victory. I mean, another one is Mutaguchi, who is the commander of the 18th Indian Division at Singapore and who is now in Burma and has just taken over command of the 15th Army in Burma from General Aida, made the comment to a command conference that the British are weaker than, that's a mistake, sorry, the British are weaker than the Chinese. Sorry, I made a mistake in my writing today. The British are weaker than the Chinese, which was quite a comment. And then Jack Masters, who many of you will know as a fine author of the campaign, compared Arakan 1 to that of New Orleans, Passchendaele, and the blockhead stupidities of the Boer War. And I think he's captured that pretty well. Let's move on and talk about what happened next. Well, Irwin was sacked. Wavell actually at the time was then promoted to Viceroy, and he was replaced by General Sir Claude Auchinleck. But the requirement to defeat the Japanese in Arakan continued. That didn't fall away. And Slim, now commanding 15 Corps, was given responsibility for coming up with a plan to remove the Japanese from Arakan. And he came up with basically the same plan that he had prepared the year before, which had been ignored by Irwin. First phase of which was securing the base, securing the hills and the tunnel area between Mungdor and the sea and Buthidang, known as Operational Cudgel. And secondly, Operation Bullfrog, which was the amphibious assault against Akyab, for which he was given the 2nd British Division. He had some new, fresh troops. The 14th Division was sent away to India, was reconstituted and became a training division. He had 3 new divisions. He had 5 Indian, 7 Indian, and 26 Indian, commanded by General Briggs, General Messavi, and the man on the left here you can see here, General Lomax, who commanded the 26th Indian Division, who was basically the army reserve, the Corps reserve for the operation. 5 and 7 would attack the tunnels. So I've gone back, I shouldn't have done that. So 5 division would attack Mungdor and hold on to the western side of the Mayo Range and the tunnels. 7 division would, from the Kalapanzan River, the Kalapanzan Valley down here, would take the eastern side of the Mayo Range and the tunnels, and 26th Division would sit behind in reserve. Really importantly, Slim also recognized the importance of his left flank, and he was given the 81st West African Division, 2 brigades, 2-brigade division, and he moved the West Africans, then at the time under Jackal General Woolner, down the Culloden Valley in order to be able to dominate his left flank and to deny it to the enemy. Now, lots of things had happened in the previous year. While Slim was away training Eastern Army and Irwin was faffing around in Arakan making mistake after mistake, quite a lot of change. We don't have much time left, but what you need to understand is that by the end of 1943, when Arakan 2 began, the troops were better trained. They knew much more about the Japanese. They'd spent more time in individual and collective training, fighting in the way that was required for success in the jungle. They had better leaders. Each of the 3 divisional commanders and every single one of the brigade commanders in 5, 7, and 26 Division were exceptional leaders. The man on the to the left of the picture, right as you look at it, General Christensen, was a very fine battlefield commander, and he was eventually to command 15 Corps when Slim was elevated to take command of the Eastern Army in October 1943. The Eastern Army, of course, becoming the 14th Army. So the plans that Slim had created for Arakan 2 were handed to General Christensen, who then executed them. There were a number of significant innovations that had taken place in thinking about how to fight the Japanese. The first was to ditch the idea of the physical line of communication, physical ribbon of the road, and use aerial resupply to supply troops who were cut off by Japanese infiltration. Much, much better medical care and attention. In 1940, in the First Arakan, for every combat casualty, there were 120 malarial casualties. So very significant changes took place in the management of malaria, malarial casualties, and policies and procedures for ensuring that troops, the minimum number of troops, caught the disease. Another really important point was that by 1943, we, the Allies, had air superiority over Arakan in a way the Japanese had in 1942. And I mentioned aerial resupply. For the first time, large numbers of C-47 Skytrains, so the ubiquitous DC-3 Dakota, were coming into theatre. The offensive began in at the end of 1943. It stalled a little bit with Briggs's first attacks on the tunnels, and in February 1944, Christensen decided that what he wanted to do is give Briggs a rest, and he was going to move 7 Division under Jeffrey Evans into the fray against the eastern side of the tunnels. He had built up a divisional administrative base. Jeffrey Evans had built up Frank Messervy. Jeffrey Evans was later in the year. Frank Messervy had built up a divisional administrative base at a place called Sinswaya. And at this moment, the whole world changed for them, because what was happening over in Burma was the start of the famous Japanese advance on India, Operation Yugo, which we'll talk about in detail tomorrow. But a strategic feint for Yugo was Operation Hargo under General Sakurai's 28th Army, which was to attack into Arakan and to try to draw off British and Allied reserves from Manipur and move them down to Arakan. So we had then the first Battle of Arakan, the first major battle of Arakan at Sinswaya. And some of you will have heard about the Battle of the Box. And that's where this occurred at Sinswaya. Now, we don't have any time, I'm afraid, to talk about this tonight. And we have almost run out of time, so I'm going to have to keep on going. But I'll recommend some books to talk about the Battle of the Box afterwards. It's important that you all understand, though, that the world had changed dramatically. Although 15 Corps had been preparing to advance, all of a sudden, Japanese 28th Army surrounded them, broke them up, forced the battle to change its shape. But the 15 Corps stood firm. They didn't run. They fought back valiantly. They were resupplied by air. They basically smashed the 28th Army attack, and it was the first dramatic victory of the war for the British. We don't have time to go through those, I'm afraid. What made the difference? Well, fundamentally, a plan for battle that was the product of very good leaders who could plan for understanding the best way of defeating the Japanese. New tactics, the old linear style of warfare had been thrown out. Old received ideas about fighting were thrown out and rethought and translated into military doctrine. Troops had been soundly trained, both individually and corporately, so collectively. Collective training was a very, very significant feature of the latter part of 1943. And the ferocity of the training that the whole of what became the 14th Army went through was formidable. One of the great transformations in military affairs of any place in the world in the Second World War took place in India and on the edge of Burma in 1943 to translate what had been a rather moribund army into quite an extraordinary one. Aerial resupply and tanks. Well, of course, tanks were used for the first time in Arakan in 1944. You all know of Captain Tom or Colonel Tom being in an armored regiment in Arakan. Well, this is where he was deployed. Tanks were first used by Briggs and Messervy in the attacks on the tunnels. They were also used in to counter the Japanese Hargo operation, and then subsequently used extensively in 1944. We're going to have to very quickly move on. And I've run out of time, but really what I want to say about 1945, I can say very, very quickly. Third Arakan, 1945. Forgive my map. I was struggling today to try and find a good map of Arakan 1945. I haven't found one. This is from Slim's Defeat into Victory. So I will get Osprey to draw me a new map for my next book. But effectively what we had in 1945, and you're going to have to, I do understand that we're leaping forward here chronologically, and we haven't actually discussed together Imphal and Kohima, which is tomorrow night. But by if we just focus on Arakan, what we can see in 1945 was a complete transformation in ideas about how to defeat the Japanese. And I want to just prompt you with one idea tonight, and that is the effectiveness of long-range penetration. We saw that Irwin had the opportunity of using Wingate in 1942, and he didn't fight for it and lost it. We saw that Slim wanted to use long-range penetration in 1943-44 and used the 81st West African Division, and they had a limited effect, positive effect. But in 1944, in 1945, in the last operations, successful operations in Arakan, they had a decisive, indeed I would say dramatic effect. Because what happened was the 81st West African Division drove down the Culloden Valley here, right behind the Japanese positions up here on the Mayo Range and in Akyab, and at the last moment persuaded General Sakurai to withdraw all his troops from Akyab down to here, and Akyab was taken without a fight. The Queen Elizabeth II, the venerable battleship, which had last fired its 15-inch guns at Gallipoli in 1915, fired them in support of the attacks on Akyab and later Ramari Island. But the Japanese had fled, all because of the 81st West African Division in the Culloden Valley. So without doing much fighting, the very presence of two brigades in the Culloden Valley completely dominated Japanese thinking and forced them to conform to this plan. Now that's something that's really, really important to think about in terms of the way in which you deliver an operational plan in warfare like this, or indeed any warfare. Understand what you need to do to achieve your strategic objective without necessarily blatting the enemy and pulling all your resources together to fight a force-on-force confrontation. Arakan 1945 was dramatically successful because it avoided that. Lots of hard fighting down here further in Arakan in January and February 1945, particularly at a place called Kangor here. The An Pass is clearly shown here, going over into the Irrawaddy Valley at Magway. But this is really, really important. The Kangor Valley fighting took place over 4 days, very serious fighting, but it was nothing on the fighting that would have had to take place for Akyab had the 81st Division not been down the Culloden Valley. Now we've run out of time. I've got a final slide which just asks you to think about the strategic effect of long-range penetration by the 81st Division. I've got 82nd there as well. That's only because 2 brigades of the 82nd joined the 81st, but there we are. For 9 whole months, the West Africans were on air or aerial resupply. It's extraordinary. 9 months. Think of that in the Culloden Valley. What they achieved, no one knows about it. There weren't any war correspondents marching with them. It's completely forgotten part of the Burma campaign. But I suggest to you, before we discuss Michenar and the Chindits in 2 nights' time, that the West Africans had a greater strategic effect on the course of the Burma campaign than did the Chindits. Now, that's going to put some cats among the pigeons, but I think that's a sort of note that we need to end on. I'm going to make some book recommendations. If you can see me, this is doesn't have a cover. This is a fabulous book called The Battle of the Box, produced a very long time ago, 1979, by Patrick Turnbull, and it goes through the Battle of Sinswaya, the original Battle of the Box, in great detail, and it's a very, very good, easy read. My good friend James Holland, a couple of years ago, pushed out a book which he called Burma 44. It's about the same battle, Arakan 2, and the Battle of Sinswaya, the Battle of the Box. There's a good lot of context around this in terms of why the battle happened in the first place. James is a brilliant writer, really accessible, and he knows his stuff, so I do recommend that. And finally, I'm a great fan of the West Africans. I really am. I do believe that they achieved quite extraordinary results. John Hamilton wrote Warbush a number of years ago. He was a young officer with the West Africans. He died a couple of years ago. And this is a very, very good detailed account of the operations in Arakan in 1944-45, actually earlier than that, 43-44 as well. And it's a wonderful story, actually, of the West Africans. Who were they? Why were they recruited? What did they achieve? How did they carry out their operations? There aren't many of these. This is privately published. There aren't many copies around, but you'll be able to get it through the library system. I really, really encourage people who want to spend a bit of time really trying to understand the colonial dimension to the 14th Army and Arakan itself. Read Warbush, and it's not as, I mean, it's not as, he's quite a good writer. That's what I'm trying to say. I think that's probably all I need to say. We've probably got a few minutes for questions as well.
Yeah, but thank you, Rob. Ladies and gents, we do have some time for questions, so do either write them in the box or raise your hand, and we'll get those to Rob. Just from me, Rob, I find it fascinating talking about the Arakan. In my position here, doing tours out to Myanmar, when we get inquiries, people who are coming out here with the purpose of looking more into the Second World War, often it is the admin box in the Arakan that they're usually asking for. And of course, unfortunately, now it's one of the hardest places to visit in Myanmar, being modern day Rakhine State.
Yeah, well, I would love to spend time there as well. It's but as you know, it's impossible. I was involved with a film many years ago now, in 2013, where we managed to get access to parts of it, but it's just out of the question now. It's a very interesting place because it encapsulates the defeat to victory of the entire Burma campaign, and it shows it in microcosm. It shows the terrible failures of 1942. It really hauls them out and puts them under the light, and is a good measure for explaining how to transform an army. What you need to do to transform an army is start thinking about what you need to do to fight, then draw up your plans, then train people, and then execute.
So on that point, so a question from me. So am I right in thinking that it was the tactic of the box that was a significant factor in the success of the later campaigns? And if so, how was that different to what the British were doing before? And what actually was the kind of tactical core of the box? What was the box, and how did they?
The box is as old as history as warfare itself, and the box simply said that when you are surrounded, simply come in on yourselves, create an all-round defense. Don't worry about your line of communication. Don't worry about how you're going to get resupply, because we're going to resupply you from the sky. And we want you to first of all defend yourselves. So it's not a physical box, but it's all-round defense. And once you've established your all-round defense, you then carry out aggressive patrol and ambush action, offensive action against the enemy. So that Edson's Weir, the whole of the 17th Indian Division, positions in the Kalimantan Valley, there were dozens of individual boxes, some of company level, some of brigade level. The divisional headquarters had their own box, and they were separate to everyone else. They just learnt to be self-contained. The very interesting thing about the Burma campaign, it was really the only place where, actually that's not true. We're talking about tomorrow night about Imphal and Kohima, lots of boxes of Imphal and Kohima. But this is a place that I think had more psychological value than tactical value, because what it demonstrated, I think, to the Indian British soldiers who had grown up with this idea of the Japanese Superman, was that actually they could defeat them. A very, very simple idea of going into all-round defense and dominating the ground around them by offensive action worked. It gave them confidence to fight the Japanese and defeat the primary Japanese tactic of infiltration. And if you think about it, the primary effect of infiltration is psychological. If you are in a traditional, conventional linear defense where you're lined up in trenches, and you get someone who's able to cross your trench and go behind you for several miles, you're going to start getting worried about them, aren't you? What are they? Where are they? What are they going to do? Are they going to turn my flank, or are they going to come around behind me and cut me off? That's the psychological problem with linear defense. If you get rid of that and say, we don't have linear defenses, what we have in a jungle environment are lots of strong points, where it doesn't matter if the enemy take out one strong point, all the others are still there. You know, linear defense is not the answer in Burma. It wasn't the answer in 1942, it wasn't the answer in 45, and it's very interesting. Owen was not able to comprehend this.
I think is it Ferguson in Wild Green Earth who talks about you know, that psychological shift of, instead of thinking that the Japanese are creeping up on you, think, well, actually no, we're surrounding them.
That's exactly right.
And it's just changing that mindset.
It was a mindset, and Slim mentioned it. In fact, everyone talked about 1944. If you go into a defensive box, so your defensive all-round position, then the Japanese are ineffective. They can't do what they wanted to do, and you have the upper hand. So this confidence thing, allied to the fact that actually Japanese didn't have huge numbers, and an infiltration operation might have 20 separate columns, but of quite small numbers. So you could then identify small groups of Japanese, surround them themselves, and wipe them out, and defeat them in patches rather than in a large linear-based battle. I'm just leaping ahead to tomorrow night. When the campaign in Manipur and Assam was over at the end of 1944, Wavell came on a tour of the battlefield, and Slim and some of the corps commanders took him around. And at the end, Wavell said, "I don't really understand this battle. It seems to have been fought in penny packets." And I think there's no record of what Slim said, but I can see him sitting there saying, well, that's what the entire war's been about. We've been sitting in penny packets, fighting the Japanese through the jungle, where it's not the power of the army that's important, it's the fortitude and the strength and the fighting commitment of every single soldier and every platoon and every company cut off in their little jungle knoll or wherever they might be, fighting their opposite numbers, multiplied up to 600,000 men. That's what the war was about, and Wavell didn't understand it.
We had a question from Rory yesterday. Actually, he was asking about any specific books or accounts that you recommend, either by or focusing on the experiences of Indian or Gurkha soldiers.
Well, quite a few. Look, let me come back with a detailed review tomorrow. A couple of very good Gurkha books. Unfortunately, there are very few books written by Indian soldiers. There's some very good books at the moment, but the two that I would recommend very heartily, written by people of Indian extraction or Indians about the war. In fact, I'll just get both of them here now. One is here we are. One is a very good book by Yasmin Khan, just called The Raj at War. And it's a general book. It's not a war about the Burma campaign. It's a very good book about trying to understand the motivations for why Indians fought in the war, and the complete context of the undivided India fighting the war. It's a very good book. I like it very much. The other one, which is really superb, same vein, but written from a different perspective, this is much more militarily focused, is Srinath Raghavan's. He's a professor of history, India's War. It's absolutely superb. Now, of course, both of these books aren't exclusively focused on the Far East. They talk about India's contribution to the war right across the Second World War, but they are really refreshing. I mean, for many, many years, this subject has been dominated by people like me, most of whom are a little bit older than me, but you know, they're white historians from the UK who've developed an interest in the campaign. But Yasmin Khan and Srinath Raghavan are really good, and it's really exciting at the moment. There's a lot of significant academic interest in India to the campaign, and it's growing every day. But in terms of, there are about 1,200 books published on the Burma campaign over the years. Very few of them, indeed, have been written by Indians who took part.
Okay. Ladies and gents, we're going to finish up in a couple of minutes. I'm just going to take you quickly to draw attention to the Forgotten Allies documentary, which I mentioned on the first day. Those of you who are watching live, you would have heard Liz talk about the Wasbies. So the as she described them, the forgotten women of the Forgotten Army. And therefore, we're going to end this section just of a quick look again at the Forgotten Allies of the Forgotten Army, which are the Myanmar veterans, the Myanmar soldiers that fought with the Allies during the campaign. A couple of years ago, Sampan Travel was the logistical partner for Grumman Productions, who made a documentary about these veterans. They followed Sally McLean and two of the trustees from the charity Help for Forgotten Allies out to Myanmar as they went to meet these veterans and to hand over medication and some money to support them in places such as Karen State and Chin State and Kayah State. And you know, these men are very old. They're very much in the twilight of their lives. And when I spoke to the guys who made the film, so you can see in the top right, you can see Alex and Luke and Max. When I spoke to them and I asked what was the incentive to make this film, it was really twofold. It was one, to record these stories for posterity's sake before it was too late. But the second reason was more simple, and actually was just to say thank you, as Alex put it, as a British man who had never really known about the sacrifice and service that these men gave to their British officers and the loyalty they displayed. Just to say thank you and to say that they are still remembered and appreciated. So it's a really good film. So if you haven't seen it, I'm sure many of you have, but if you haven't seen it, I do recommend trying to watch it. It is not easy to download or to stream, so you're going to want to either contact Grumman Productions or follow them on social media, because every few months or so there's a screening or it's appearing on History Channel, so you can watch it if you're following them. So I do recommend it because it's a lovely film about these men, and you know, it is very poignant because even since 2017 when they were filming it, a lot of these men have already passed away. So it's worth hearing their stories. Anyway, that is all from us tonight. Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you all for joining us. We will be back tomorrow for Imphal and Kohima.
Session 4. Look forward to seeing you all there tomorrow night. Make sure you bring your hats.
Lovely. All the best, everyone. Good night. We'll see you tomorrow.
Good night.